So I'm going to be talking about uh, how ecological risk assessments may be improved by integrating decision analysis frameworks and causal modeling with Bayesian networks. And my name is John Carriger. I work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Research and Development in Cincinnati. And I had given this talk, or an abbreviated version of this talk, at a CTAC meeting back in November, the North American CTAC meeting on the future of ecological risk assessment. So let's get started. This is my standard agency disclaimer. The views expressed are my own and do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the US EPA. So I wanted to start off by introducing Bayesian networks and, in a sense, demystifying them and showing how, as pointed out by Ben and Neil, at their core, you can view them as probability calculators. So I tried to find the simplest probability problem I could find, and I went to Wikipedia, their law of total probability page. And so here I'll show the solution, standard solution with the equation given in Wikipedia, and then the next slide I'll show the Bayesian network solution. So suppose two factories are supplying light bulbs to the market. Factory X's bulbs work over 5,000 hours 99% of the time, whereas factory Y's work over 5,000 hours 95% of the time. And so these two factories supply bulbs to the market. X supplies 60% of the bulbs and Y supplies 40% of the bulbs. So what is the chance that a purchased bulb will work longer than 5,000 hours? And so this gives us all the information we need to use the law of total probability to solve the problem, which is P of A. And so we just plug this into the equation down below, and the answer is 97.4% chance that a bulb will work longer than 5,000 hours. So I also wanted to use this as a chance to just introduce the components and connections of Bayesian networks, but here is the solution with a Bayesian network. And so these square boxes are random variables. We call them nodes for a Bayesian network term. And an example of a random variable or node might be coin flip with states heads or tails and 50-50. And so when they don't have an arrow going in them, then we enter an unconditional probability. So for the factory node, we have X and Y, and we enter 60-40 from the information given on the previous page. And it shows us the percent probabilities as well as bars representing the probabilities. And then when we have this arc, they usually flow in a causal direction from cause to effect when we're building models, just because it's better to make inferences with the model in this way, and it's also easier to develop probabilities normally when we have a causal kind of flow to the arrows. So when an arc appears, that indicates we have to use a conditional probability table to fill out the information for the variable. So our next variable is bulb life, where we have conditional probabilities for bulb life given the different factories. And on the bottom right, we have the conditional probability table we fill out, where we just type in the numbers here. For factory X, the bulb works over 5,000 hours 99% of the time, and works less than 5,000 hours 1% of the time, for example. And so once we put these conditional probability tables in, the network will compile and give us the answer in the variable, which is 97.4% probability that a bulb will work over 5,000 hours, which we saw on the previous page. So one of the powerful things about Bayesian networks comes when we start to perform Bayesian inference with the network once we've set up the conditional probability tables. And so in the forward direction of the arcs, we use predictive inference. So let's say we have a scenario we want to examine where only factory Y is providing the bulbs to the market. So we select the state for factory Y and update it to 100% probability that it comes from factory Y. And then the bulb life probability distribution updates from this to 95% chance, lowers to 95% chance that the bulbs will work over 5,000 hours. Going against the arcs, we can also perform inference known as diagnostic inference, like a diagnosis from a test. And let's say we purchase a bulb and the bulb works less than 5,000 hours, and we want to see which factory it came from. So we put this information, this observation, into the Bayesian network, and it updates the distribution for factory Y, telling us that it's more likely it came from factory Y than from factory X. And so we can do mixed inference also, where it goes both against the arcs and forward with the arcs, and it gets really useful when we have more complex models and we want to set up scenarios or put in different observations and see how unobserved nodes change or the probability distributions change. So I wanted to get a understanding of recent applications of Bayesian networks with risk assessments, because I think it's still a scarce thing and hasn't been fully applied to the ecological risk assessment paradigm. So I followed Landoit et al.'s methods they use for their Bayesian networks and ecosystem service modeling to search the literature. I searched Web of Science just for the last 5 years in their ecology and environmental science domains. And I searched for the title for Bayes star and network star and risk star, as well as for influence diagrams. So I found 47 articles in the last 5 years with Bayesian networks and risk in the title, and no articles with influence diagrams and risk. So influence diagrams are analogous to Bayesian networks, but they include decision nodes, so they're more decision-oriented models. I'll show an example of some in the subsequent slides. And so at the bottom below that, we have the number of articles published per year that I searched, and we don't really see a clear trend for the last 5 years, but we do see an increase in 2019, and whether this is a real trend or not remains to be seen, but I personally think it is. On the right, we have, top right, we have the number of institutions, number of publications per institution. The highest one came out of Western Washington University. That's Wayne Landis's group. Him and his students are active in applying Bayesian networks to diverse risk assessment problems. And I think I also want to point out that there's a real diversity of institutions and countries that are publishing Bayesian network and risk assessment articles, everything from China to Australia, to Finland, Poland, Iran, etc. Below that, we have the number of articles per journal, and the highest one is the CTAC journal, Integrated Environmental Assessment and Management, but there's also a diversity of different applied journals that are accepting these types of articles related to risk, environmental management, sustainability, etc. So I want to hone in on a few examples from the literature, just to see how these Bayesian networks have been used for risk assessment. This one I like because of the way they modeled multiple stressors and integrated endpoints. This is from Wayne Landis's group with Megan Harris and Jonas Stinson. They were examining ecological and human health risks for the South River, Virginia, mercury contaminated river from a previous chemical plant. And so they integrated endpoints within a cohesive model, including human health, ecological, human uses such as recreation and fisheries. They looked at multiple different chemicals, not just the main one, which is mercury, and provided a risk assessment as well as an ecosystem services assessment for the South River. Here's another example from Landis and his co-authors. This one is neat because of the multiple stressors that are included. I've circled them here. Chlorpyrifos is an insecticide that's used in the United States, and they combine that with physical stressors related to water temperature and dissolved oxygen for a river and a watershed. And their ultimate endpoint is the Chinook salmon population size, but the intermediate nodes between the stressors and the endpoint are really neat, I think, how they piece together different types of evidence for biochemical inhibition, behavior impacts such as swimming rate, endpoints related to survival as well as reproduction, and use this for simulations, population level simulations for the Chinook salmon for different years, seasons, and segments of the area they were looking at. This one, it had a really big impact. It was on the news in the US a lot, and this is primarily North American articles, did a polar bear risk assessment. They did a series of journal articles looking at different aspects of sea ice loss and climate change. And this one is an example they published in Nature in 2010. And so they used the Bayesian network to fuse models related to climate, habitat, sea ice loss, and persistence variables for polar bears in 4 Arctic regions around the world. And they examine impacts of climate and other stressors together with climate on extinction risks. And they found that extinction is not most probable if the temperature change is kept below certain levels. I think it was 1.25 degrees Celsius average, and traditional management is maintained, although they still predicted losses in that scenario. This is an allied article by some of the same co-authors where they expanded the number of stressors. The green node at the bottom is one related to the population trend for polar bears, and the yellow one are all different types of stressors that they included. And I think the methods they used in this are really neat, how they brought together different experts and modeling and data and had review stages of the model to determine that they were using the best available evidence in the best ways possible. And the stressors are very diverse, related to things like oil and gas, mining, shipping, tourism, different types of contaminants. And they found similar conclusions to the one before, and they found that sea ice loss is probably one of the biggest threats based on the information in the model. Here's another complex one. This is more of a hypothetical framework that Mace Barron and I did after the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And I wanted to show this one to point out that this is a Bayesian decision network. So this is a little bit more management and decision modeling oriented. And that comes through the addition of these decision nodes in blue. So we have one for deep ocean response, for offshore response to the spill, and for onshore response to the spill, as well as these utility nodes, which are value scales reflecting the preference for different outcomes for costs and ecosystem service impacts from the decision. And so we tried to integrate different things related to fate and transport of oil to explore how Bayesian networks can be useful to set up risk assessment problems prior to a spill and frame the knowledge you need, and as well as include the impacts of potential responses to the spill. And within the decision nodes, we don't have probabilities. We have expected utilities, which are probability weighted utilities in these utility nodes. And in this, we set up a scenario where we have a deep ocean response, a deep dispersant application, an offshore response, and then it gives us on the bottom node an onshore response prediction by the highest expected utility. And so we can run various scenarios with different trajectory currents and sea states and examine impacts on risks with this. So the primary thing I want to talk about is the future of risk assessment, and predicting where risk assessment will go is difficult. And the framework itself, the qualitative methodological part of risk assessment, has been robust and logical and useful over the years since it was developed in the 1980s, but has been expanding to meet new needs and applications such as weight of evidence type problems, evidence synthesis, as well as causality type problems, especially with some of the causal modeling developed by the EPA. And the quantitative methods within the framework themselves have been changing a lot, and they continue to propagate and mature. We've seen a lot of improvements to effects analysis, such as better acute chronic benchmarks for ecosystems and species sensitivity distributions reflecting more ecological endpoints. Exposure analysis has been improving with new and improved mechanistic models, as well as empirical distributions, especially better ways of handling non-detect data and chemical analysis. And risk characterization has benefited from these two things. So risk characterization integrates effects analysis and exposure analysis for predicting risks. And we've had improvements to hazard quotients, the information that goes into them, as well as the uncertainties and joint probability curves, as well as case-based reasoning has been applied to multi-species assessments or multi-species effects analysis in Holland with the model PERPEST. But new methods are always on the horizon. Machine learning hasn't been really integrated into the risk assessment framework, and I have seen a lot of useful things, especially with large spatial data sets. Uncertainty analysis tools haven't been fully integrated with qualitative uncertainty, especially stuff you can't capture in probabilities, semi-quantitative and quantitative analysis. Weight of evidence frameworks are being developed and are in development. EPA recently came up with a report reviewing weight of evidence frameworks. And systematic reviews and meta-analysis have had a huge impact, as we know, in human health. And are now having a big impact and will have one in the future with ecological risk assessment. But I don't think it's impossible to predict a potential pathway for the future of risk assessment. So one of the key things to remember is that risk assessment is used for translating the science, the environmental science we use for decision making. That's the benefit of a risk assessment. And so better integrating risk assessment with decision analysis will lead to more impactful risk assessments for decision makers and policy and better management of risks. So causal understanding is a key component for decision making, and this is why these Bayesian networks are such powerful tools, I think, for risk assessment. We think about the world in terms of causality, and we think especially about decision making in terms of causal understanding. And so decision analysis and causal modeling could and should be part of this future of ecological risk assessment. So I wanted to go over some of the things related to these topics about risk assessments and decision making. Especially there's a couple, I think, touchstone kind of references that are really useful to look at when you're exploring these types of endeavors. The first is a report from the National Academy of Sciences in the US that was sponsored by the EPA and had an expert panel from industry, academia, and government researchers that came up with this report about better integrating decision-making with risk assessment. And they developed a framework that's really useful to look at for risk-based decision-making and called for more detailed and integrative problem formulation. Adam Finkel came up with a paradigm called solution-focused risk assessment. He's a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And so this was published in HERA back in 2011, and subsequently he's applied this framework to different problems such as gene drives and synthetic biology. And he said the risk assessment should focus on risk reduction. Candidate decisions should be proposed before initiating the risk assessment and used to help set up scenarios with the risk assessment. And he contrasts something called assessment first, which is how things he says were done in the past, where people focus more on the scientific aspects of the assessment and reducing uncertainties, versus solution focus, where we should move to where we're trying to provide information that can improve or change decisions with the risk assessment. And he advocated focusing on identifying which alternatives best reduce overall risk costs effectively with the assessments. The inventor of Bayesian networks, Udaya Pearl, a computer science professor at UCLA, recently wrote a book called The Book of Why, which I really, if you're interested in these types of discussions, I really recommend getting this book. It kind of summarizes a lot of his theories of causality and how causal modeling will impact the science in the future. And he provides really complete theories that really simplify causality and make it useful for all types of researchers, and also gives powerful advice for decision making and qualitative as well as quantitative advice and tools. And he claims, one of the things I thought was really powerful, simple but powerful, is he claims the qualitative diagrams that we were looking at, the graphs for the Bayesian networks, mirror how we think about causality and cause and effect with the chain of cause and effect events. And the quantitative aspects provide powerful tools for assessing causal issues and risk assessments, especially ones that are from information theory, and we can use the causal power kind of calculations to compare the effects of different stressors on different endpoints. So I wanted to move more into the decision analysis aspects, and this is a decision analysis framework from the Structured Decision-Making textbook from Gregory et al., which I think is really useful. This is adapting a lot of previous decision analysis frameworks, but applying it more towards environmental management type issues. And so I wanted to just briefly run through the different steps. Starting at the top, we have clarify the decision context. So the decision context contains all the options that we're going to be using, so we should understand the different constraints and the different values and capabilities and stuff like that. And that will have a big influence on the analysis. And the next step, we define our objectives, which are expressions of what is important in the problem, such as costs and benefits, and the measures for these costs and benefits. And then from these two steps, we develop our alternatives, and often there'll be existing alternatives, a status quo alternative or no action one, as well as ones that we might develop to better achieve our objectives. And we use the alternatives and objectives to estimate consequences on the objectives and key uncertainties. And then we use the consequence analysis to evaluate the trade-offs. These are values-based trade-offs. How much would I be willing to sacrifice for management costs? For habitat might be an example of a trade-off. And we select the best decision. And then the final step is implement, monitor, and review. This is where adaptive management comes in. So I want to go over a couple of these steps and maybe just show some demonstrations of how causal modeling of Bayesian networks can augment these types of information gathering steps. So this is in a paper I did in 2018, and it's based off of the Coastal Louisiana Master Plan from 2012. And I wanted to take different categories of variables and put them into this logic model and kind of show how we can frame the bigger context of the different portfolio decisions that have to be made. And so this is a state agency in Louisiana that's controlling land loss from sea level rise. And in the center, in the yellow, we have different variables related to land loss issues. And actually, this is based on the modeling groups that the Coastal Louisiana Master Plan is using with different experts and a lot of more detailed kind of things behind these different categories. The gray ones are the different decisions available, everything from restoration projects such as marsh creation and sediment diversion and shoreline protection to structural things, building things such as concrete walls and levees, to more community-oriented type things such as building codes and education and floodproofing, etc. The green are controlling factors. So these are things that will influence the success of the decisions, but they're kind of outside the purview of what the decisions can achieve outside the system in a sense. Things like sea level rise and subsidence rates, storm rainfall, evapotranspiration. And in the blue, we have our objectives related to environmental and human impacts. So I think even if you have a narrower context, more focused on a few of these decisions or one of these decisions, having something like this that can kind of group the different decisions together and look at the bigger picture could also be really useful. And the CDC uses these, Center for Disease Control in the US, uses these logic type models for developing systematic reviews for community health interventions. So we can look at each of the steps like that and kind of look where causal modeling, Bayesian networks, and the risk assessment frameworks and tools can benefit a decision analysis and or environmental management framework like this. And so I kind of explored that a bit. This is something I'm still thinking about and developing, but with the time left, I also wanted to go through one more step, and that's the adaptive management one. So I did the first and the last one, and looking at results change in particular, combined with Bayesian networks. So I'll go through a few things that are related to the implementation stage of decision making. So here's an adaptive management model that very simplified, but something that would be useful for examining model uncertainty. Oftentimes you have these structural uncertainties and different candidate models that you're using and that you're weighing and things like that. And so let's say in this we have a decision related to recreation restriction decisions, current, medium, and high are the potential decisions. And we want to examine the influence on the status of a resource, like maybe a coral reef with a marine protected area. And so let's say we implement an adaptive management experiment and we examine what happens if we establish high restrictions in a certain area, and then we observe that there's a decrease, not an increase or a stabilization of the resource status. And we look at this information and how it impacts the probabilities of different models. And if we start off weighting them equally, we can see that model B is 90% chance of being more accurate than model A. And we can use these model weights to use for subsequent decisions or subsequent experiments and update the model weights with the different experiments and information. And oftentimes we might have a complex model. So this is also related to the land loss issue. And let's say we have a sediment diversion decision. On the left, we have a complex analytical analytical framework. On the gray node is following the previous slide's colors. The gray node is our decision node, the diversion strategy, diverting river with sediment to different areas to build land. And we have a lot of intermediary to our blue nodes, these different objectives. And so we can use result chains are very useful for kind of examining whether our decision making when we're implementing is staying on track and how we can correct course if it's not. And so that's the result chain on the right. Let's say this, we wanted to look at the influence and of the decision on socioeconomic benefits or ultimate goal for fisheries. And so the top level one is constructing a channel for diverting sediment. Our target is completion. So this is more of an implementation level result that we're looking at. Next, we want to make sure our diversion capacity is exceeding the levels that we want or need. And so we have a flow rate below that. Next, we want to make sure the sediment is being retained in the area we're trying to rebuild. So we have a sediment retention rate of interest, 75%. Then we want to make sure the land is actually being built. How many acres per year? 24 is our goal, our target. And then we want to make sure the wetlands have a high integrity as well as are able to form high integrity fish habitat. And then after that's achieved, we examine whether the fishery socioeconomic benefits from high catch per unit effort are being achieved. And so we can use this to kind of look at the different steps that have to occur from the decision to an objective and a goal, and as well as which things might impact these different things from occurring, as well as how we might be able to correct course with additional decisions. And so I think Nyberg et al.'s paper is very useful. It came out in 2006, and he combined Bayesian networks with adaptive management steps. And so I briefly want to go through the different steps. Excuse me. So on the left, we have the adaptive management framework steps, and on the right in bold, we have the corresponding Bayesian network development for adaptive management steps. So first, you assess the problem or opportunity. This is where we build our model structure, set up the probabilities, run sensitivity analysis to interpret the Bayesian network. Then we design a management experiment to test the decisions. We design and select the management experiments based on the Bayesian network. We implement the experiment and we monitor the system responses, and we compare with our Bayesian network predictions. And then we evaluate the outcomes from the experiment and learn and use that to modify the knowledge that we have in the Bayesian network by updating the structure. And we maybe have different candidate structures we're comparing if we're looking at potential causes and effects, as well as updating the probabilities in the Bayesian network. And then we adapt the Bayesian network as our knowledge representation tool to future decisions. So we use it for future decisions and future management experiments with the new information we obtained from adaptive management. So in conclusion, risk assessment is the backbone of how decisions are made in environmental science and how we use our ecotoxicology and environmental exposure data. And Bayesian networks make quantitative risk assessment tractable. They really come, their power really comes in more complex kind of problems, but they're also useful in simple ones. And Bayesian networks are at the forefront of causal assessments. And once again, I recommend that Udea Pearl book, The Book of Why. And all fields can benefit one another: decision analysis, ecological risk assessment, and Bayesian networks. And I think more generalists that are fluent in these areas and will improve the science and practice of risk assessment as well as environmental decision making. And so that's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, John. It was extremely interesting. We have plenty of time for questions, so I can go ahead and open that up to everyone. You can either unmute yourself and ask your questions verbally, or if you don't have access to a mic, please add them through the chat to everyone, and we can try and monitor that and read the questions out loud. And if nobody has any question starting off, I have a question to start us off.
Sure.
So you were saying that there, just in terms of how some of these frameworks and the things that are at your disposal in terms of these analyses might change going into the future, how difficult or how much resistance is there to implement these sort of groundbreaking ways of conducting risk assessment into actual policy decisions at that sort of decision level, if that makes sense?
Personally, I've not experienced too much resistance. I think there's a lot of interest in it, but it does take some adaptation, like you're saying, to understand these different tools and how they could potentially benefit risk assessment and decision making and stuff. So yeah, it's still very new, and Bayesian networks are still a scarce thing, I would say.
Mm.
But I think it's changing a lot. As I showed in that one slide, and I really think that there's been a big increase in usage that I've experienced in interest in these types of tools.
Yeah. Okay, Sam has a question. How easy is it to communicate Bayesian networks to stakeholders, policymakers, and especially the public? Do you try to explain the statistical framework or give an easier to understand example?
I haven't done active research with Bayesian networks and stakeholders and the public, but there has been a lot of groups that are working in that area, and I think there's some really good literature that's instructive on communicating Bayesian networks. But I recommend the structured decision making book, where I got the framework for decision analysis that I was showing earlier, and they talk about how they use the qualitative side of Bayesian networks for on-the-fly discussions and stakeholder workshops to kind of capture and explain what experts are saying. And I think they are very powerful communication tools, especially when you think back to that Udea Pearl comment about, this is how we think about the world. We think about it in causal terms, and these types of effect and flow diagrams seem to capture that pretty well.
Yannicka, I see that your hand is raised. Yannicka?
Sorry, I just had to go into another room. not alone. Thank you very much, John, for the presentation. And I would just like to mention to those of you who don't know this that John was invited for a full week workshop at NIVA in mid-March. And then I think less than 24 hours before your flight, EPA staff were no longer allowed to travel. So we were, you can imagine, very disappointed. But then during this week where John should have been in Oslo, all of Norway shut down. So maybe it was the best after all. I hope we can still have this workshop sometime later. But anyway, I also had a question kind of following up this issue of communication to stakeholders. My experience with Bayesian network modeling so far has also been mostly academic or with other researchers. Now I'm involved in a project not directly related to eco-risk, but where we use Bayesian networks for innovative evidence context. And we actually just discussed earlier today with some colleagues how to present the outcome. I want to present it as a probability of an effect beyond the threshold or probability of an adverse effect, say. This is how I think risk per definition is meant to be, and that's the strength of the Bayesian network, that you can present or model probabilities. Others are more into the traditional risk assessment approach and like to have, say, a risk quotient or a single number with a confidence interval, which is more people or stakeholders or risk assessors are more familiar with a single number output. So I was wondering, John, if you have experience with trying to present results as probability distributions or just the probability of exceeding some threshold, something like this, rather than a single number, and if people are willing to accept this, or do they still want their single number endpoint? Long question.
I have a lot of experience with when I was working in South Florida at the universities down there. I worked at the Everglades National Park on the risk assessments and stuff like that, and so we had a lot. We had to communicate a lot to different managers and policymakers and things like that. And at the time we didn't have, I wasn't familiar with Bayesian networks, so I think having Bayesian networks back then would have been a lot easier to communicate the results and stuff like that, because people really, I think, can see how things are calculated. It's a lot easier to look at the Bayesian network and see the calculation and looking at the law of total probability equation, for example, and it gets even easier when you're dealing with complex kind of multi-dimensional kind of issues. And so I think having that and having that cause effect kind of backbone with the qualitative along with the probabilities that you're discussing, I think that's a very powerful kind of tool available for communication. And the Bayesian networks have been adapted for, I think, for cognitive mapping, the qualitative side of them and stuff. There's been a lot of research, especially recently with that, with the stakeholders and decision makers, and lots more research that needs to be done, I think, as far as communicating the probabilities from what I've seen in the literature.
How about this, your recent paper where you model a distribution of a risk quotient? Was there any interest of using the distribution in this case, or are people still more interested in the single risk quotient? Do you have any impression of that?
Yeah, that one's really recent, and I had really good experiences, I think, when I was presenting it at CTAC and stuff like that. I think people really like seeing the model, the Bayesian network model over the Monte Carlo kind of equations, and seeing the distributions in the nodes and stuff like that, and seeing the potential possibilities of expanding the model with more causal kind of issues and additional stressors and things. I think it's a lot easier to kind of communicate and examine those types of issues with the Bayesian network is what I was seeing. And Mace Barron, who did the Monte Carlo, the initial one, when he saw the Bayesian network outcome, he was really excited about it, and now wants to apply the Bayesian network to more recent issues with the Florida Panther, which was our project. And yeah, so we're working with state people down there with getting new data and stuff like that, and doing the analysis with a more full Bayesian network. So I'm really excited about that in the future. But yeah, I think the Bayesian network has a lot of advantages for communicating risk with scientists as well as with lay people.
Yeah, I'm asking, of course, because we are also planning or already trying to use this method in this project. So it's very interesting to hear about your experiences and other people's experiences when trying to communicate this outside of the of the project. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Taylor has asked a question through text. He's asking, I've heard that expert opinion can be incorporated into Bayesian networks. Could you provide some insight regarding this? And possibly to follow up, are you familiar with any examples of traditional knowledge from indigenous groups being incorporated into Bayesian networks?
Oh, okay. Yeah, those are good questions. For the first one, for the expert opinion one, there's some recent work that's been done that are Bayesian network specific for incorporating expert opinion. That expert opinion can get, when you have a complex model and you have a lot of distributions to develop, it can get unwieldy and stuff. And so I think some of the recent research I've been seeing has been finding tractable but rigorous ways of capturing probability distributions using the Bayesian network and the structure as well as the distribution needs. And what was the second part related to the?
Yes. Are you familiar with any examples of traditional knowledge from indigenous groups being incorporated into Bayesian networks?
The structured decision-making textbook, I think, has a lot of the practitioners who wrote the textbook. Robin Gregory et al. Was the citation. That they've done a lot of work with indigenous groups in Canada, First Nations there, and so I think they have a lot of experience and a lot of publications that, as well as stories in the book about incorporating traditional knowledge and things like that, and for decision-making purposes. So I recommend that, and they use influence diagrams with other decision analytic structures and provide really useful guidance for that.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? You can, again, either raise your hand, just jump in on the audio, or write them through the text. John, I do have one other question for you, maybe a little bit less based on the science, but most of the people on the call here are currently working on their PhDs, myself included. So is there anything that you, if you had a time machine, you can go back and tell yourself as a PhD student, what you would tell yourself that you could tell us now?
I think done trumps perfect might be. Yeah. I think I spent a lot of time trying to really perfect, too much time trying to perfect certain aspects of my dissertation that I probably should have settled just for what I had at the moment, you know. So.
Great. Okay. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming in or anyone else with their hands raised. So I think we can go ahead and call that a wrap. John, thank you very much for organizing this talk. Again, it's quite a shame that you weren't able to go to Norway to deliver this, but I really, really enjoyed this. Huge thank you from all of EcoRescue here for sharing your work with us. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for your interest and for listening, and especially thank you, John, and thank you, Yannicka, for helping to arrange and organize this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so have a great afternoon, everyone. And John, I guess, have a great morning and the rest of your day.
Great. You too, John.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Take care.
Yeah, bye.